Hello and welcome to Independence Institute Television on YouTube. I am your host, Justin Longo, and with me in the studio is Professor Rob Natelson, as always. And today we're going to be talking about a blog post Rob did on his blog, constitution.i2i.org. If you want to check out what Rob has to say and what Rob's been up to at the Independence Institute, you should check out Rob's blog, constitution.i2i.org. So he wrote this post a while ago, Rob, where you described why Latin is so important to you and other scholars of the founding era. And I know that you can speak it. This is very strange, but you can. So why Latin?
You want that answer in English?
I would prefer it because I'm not sure our audience here on iVoices at Independence Institute TV can understand what you're going to say. So I'll take English.
Well, you know, over the past 50 years or so, the Latin language, which used to be the mainstay of education in the United States, has been progressively removed from our schools. And in doing so, what we're really doing is cutting off the American plant at the roots. I mean, we're severing ourselves from our roots. And the reason the language is important to any constitutional scholar or anyone who really wants to understand the Constitution is because it was essentially the founder's second language. Every boy who had any hope of a college education would start studying Latin at the age of about 8. Some girls also did, although girls tended to focus more on modern languages. They would initially go to school for perhaps 3 years and learn their ABCs and get basic literacy and understanding of arithmetic and so forth. But then they would go into a school that was called a Latin school. And the Latin school, of which the most famous surviving example is the Boston Latin School, which is still in existence today. The Latin school was the school that prepared boys for college. And during the course of this period of time, boys were expected to become essentially fluent in Latin, in the same way that some Americans today are fluent in Spanish. They had to be able to not just speak it and to read it, but also to be able to translate produce good translations from Latin into English and from English back into Latin. In the course of studying the language, they of course studied the literature that the language is written in. Now, most people know that Latin was the language of the western half of the Roman Empire, but Latin remained the language of the international scholarly community right through the founding, so for centuries thereafter. And so through this language, they could study philosophy, history, geography, science, mathematics, the list goes on and on. As well as this huge and abundant corpus of Roman and Greek classical works. I say Greek because many of the Greek works were translated into Latin. It was very common to read Plutarch, for example, who had originally written in Greek, to read his biographies in Latin. Now, many of the more educated founders also went on and studied Greek as well, including, for example, James Madison. But Latin was really the mainstay.
So we've got the founding era, I guess, educated folks in the founding era were bilingual by all accounts.
Yeah,
right?
Essentially
Did
that's
they
right.
use, I mean, was it used in common everyday life, or was it just something that was like more of an education? You use Latin when you're at school, or you use it when you're studying, but you don't really use it at home.
I don't see too much evidence that they actually spent much time speaking it, unless you had two people who came from countries and they didn't know each other's vernacular language. Then it was common to speak it. And not too much before the Common Era, not too much before the founding era, it was the language of universities. Francis Hutcheson, who was a Scottish philosopher, very popular among the founders, who wrote in the early part of the 18th century, was really the first Scottish professor to lecture in English. Before that, everybody lectured in Latin. In addition, much of the law was written in Latin. The older founders had all studied their law through a book called The Institutes of Edward Cook. And Cook's Institutes have long passages of untranslated Latin. In addition, many of the cases have long instances of long passages of untranslated Latin. When I did my research on the necessary and proper clause, I found that the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution goes back to British documents that were in fact written in Latin. That necessary and proper is necessaria et opportuna. That was actually the original phrase used. And so, while I haven't found much evidence that they actively spoke the language, they used it in their professional lives a lot.
All right, so here's the million-dollar question. Why is it important for scholars like yourself and for laymen that are interested in the founding era? Why is it important for them to understand Latin to some extent? How did Latin influence the founding generation's views on what they did with the revolution and everything like that?
Well, let me give you a hypothetical. Suppose that 200 years from now, people came across the fact that some person had said enthusiastically, "The king lives." An American had said that. If the person didn't know anything about the culture of our time, the person might think, gee, did America have a king? Is this person talking maybe about the British monarch? But gee, there was a queen, not a king in 2014. It's only because we know that the king is Elvis Presley and that some people have traditionally clung to the notion that Elvis still lives, that we can translate the king lives as meaning Elvis is still around.
Yeah.
And so you really have to be able to understand a culture to be able to understand what is said by people in that culture. So, for example, if you come across a letter written by Gouverneur Morris, and he says "medio tutissimus ibis," which translates out to "you're safest if you go down the middle," you might not understand at all what the connection is unless you had read Ovid's Metamorphoses, in which it's a very famous passage in which Apollo advises his son, who's going to be driving his chariot, not to go too close to the heavens on the one side, nor too close to the earth on the other. It's best if you go through the middle. In addition, many of the words in the Constitution itself have Latinate meanings. Very common example: more perfect union. I came across an article by some person not too long ago in which the writer was sort of scratching his head and saying, "What do the founders mean by more perfect? Isn't perfect? Doesn't that mean already without flaw?" And the answer is that in 18th century English, the word perfect usually meant complete. They're talking about a more complete union, more complete than the Articles of Confederation. Or here's another example. A well-known legal historian once concluded that the founders intended for the Senate to be the primary body for conducting foreign policy, not the president. He based this upon the fact that the founders repeatedly referred to the president as the agent for foreign policy, and so he's thinking, gee, the president must be the agent of the Senate. Well, in 18th century English, the word agent was often used in a way that was directly parallel to the Latin equivalent, and that simply means the actor. The president was to be the actor in foreign policy, not the subordinate of the Senate. He completely misunderstood what the founders were saying because they were using a Latinate version of the word agent.
So knowing Latin and knowing the classical works and knowing what the founders knew to some extent can better inform what they intended and what they meant when they said things, obviously.
Sure.
So now here's the next million-dollar question is, if you're some guy in the U.S. right now that's interested in this stuff and follows your work and things like that, this guy might not necessarily want to take the time to learn Latin, front and back, and be able to speak it with you. So how can somebody know enough to get a better understanding but not have to be fluent Is that possible?
Well, that's one reason I wrote my book, The Original Constitution, What It Actually Said and Meant.
You don't say.
Yeah, the purpose is to translate that for modern audiences. For example, the founders expected the Constitution to be interpreted, and they expected it to be interpreted according to certain guidelines, which were almost all written out in Latin. So in my book, I explain those guidelines, and of course I translate them. But for the serious scholar, somebody who isn't satisfied with simply understanding what the original Constitution meant, but really wants to get into it at some depth, there's no substitute for not having a good working understanding of the Latin language. And you don't have to take my word for it. Forrest MacDonald, who is a historian and probably the foremost constitutional historian alive in America today, made the point himself in a book which he pointedly named, entitled Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages, the Latin title. And one of the points he makes very early in the book is that it really is virtually required for serious constitutional studies to know Latin, because otherwise it's very, very difficult to get inside the heads of the founders or the framers.
So what you're saying is, for me, somebody who's interested in these kinds of things and likes having these conversations with you, I don't have to necessarily put the work in and learn the language. You did that. You put the work in. You learned the language. You went to all the source materials, like you've described before, of how you've been to England to go digging for research and everything like that. You did the work, and that work is in the original Constitution, your book. That's
right. I mean, you're an economist, okay? You're not a constitutional scholar.
I want to be.
You're an economist, and you are interested in the Constitution, and so a book like mine will serve the purpose. But those people, for example, who want to be constitutional law professors really need to know the language.
If our listeners and our viewers here in YouTube land want to know more about you, your work, where should they go?
Well, the best place is to go to constitution.i2i.org. That's constitution. The letter I, the number 2, the letter I.org. And check out the book, which there's a link to that on the website, The Original Constitution, What It Actually Said and Meant. There are also a fair number of articles that are available for download, as well as essays and observations on all sorts of constitutional subjects.
To hear the latest from the Independence Institute, check out Independence Institute Television. Thanks for watching.